All right, get ready to dive into some Halloween happenings. You sent over some interesting sources. We've got these news articles about President Biden at a White House trick-or-treat thing, and then some pretty in-depth research about the history of Halloween itself. You're obviously interested in more than just a president and some babies, right?
Yeah, it seems like you're really digging into the whole cultural context here. It's not just about like the event itself, but how it's being presented, and maybe even like how Halloween has become what it is today.
Exactly. And, we can't do a deep dive without looking at things from different angles, right? So we've got Fox News, which tends to be more conservative, and the Associated Press, which is generally seen as more neutral, both covering the same thing.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how those two narratives differ.
Okay, so let's set the scene. President Biden's at the White House. It's a Halloween event. You've got those cute babies all dressed up, and there are these photos of him interacting with them. Now, Fox News uses the word biting and says that the president didn't seem to mind the interaction,
Hmm.
almost like it was a chore or something.
Interesting. The Associated Press goes with joking bites,
Yeah.
a much lighter way to put it. It's really interesting how the words they choose can completely change how you see things.
Yeah, totally. And it gets even more interesting. Fox News mentions President Biden's age. He's 81. And they bring up his Republicans' comments from before. It almost seems like they're trying to paint a certain picture. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And the AP, they focus on Jill Biden's costume. She was a panda.
Oh, right.
Apparently a nod to those pandas that just came back to the National Zoo. And they talk about her reading initiative, Hello Read, where she read 10 spooky pumpkins to the kids. It's like they're highlighting the wholesome, feel-good parts of the event.
It makes you think about what they each wanted you to think, right?
Yeah.
So what do you make of this? Is it like straight up media bias or just different reporting styles?
That's a question that comes up all the time.
Yeah.
There's always going to be some subjectivity in how news is presented. Think about it. The words they use, the photos they pick, what they decide to emphasize, what they leave out, it all shapes how we see things.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's the question of whether what Biden did was appropriate for a president. Some people might think it's harmless fun, and others might think it's, I don't know, unpresidential.
Right. It's one of those things where there's no clear-cut answer. You have to think about cultural norms and what people expect from a president, and even just generational differences in what's considered okay. It's a real gray area.
Definitely. Okay, let's zoom out a little bit now. We've got this modern event, very public, and you also sent research about the origins of Halloween itself. That's a pretty big jump, so help me connect the dots. What does a president trick-or-treating have to do with ancient Celtic festivals and Christian traditions?
It might seem like a big leap, but think about it this way. Both of them are about the power of tradition, how rituals change over time, and how we use those traditions to understand the world around us. Halloween, the way we celebrate it now, is on October 31st, the day before the Western Christian feast of All Hallows Day.
All Hallows Eve. Now it makes sense why we call it Halloween.
Exactly. And that starts All Hallowtide, which is when Christians remember the dead, saints, martyrs, anyone who has died. So some people see Halloween as totally secular, just costumes and candy, but others still recognize that Christian connection. But here's what's really interesting. Both of those interpretations, and everything in between, exist because traditions change and mix together over time.
That's what I love about history, seeing how it all comes together.
Yeah.
You mentioned traditions changing, so where does something like trick-or-treating fit into all of this?
That's a great example. Trick-or-treating, with kids going door to door in costumes, can actually be traced back to something called souling in the Middle Ages.
Souling, that sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Picture this. People going door to door and saying prayers for the dead. And in return, they'd get these little treats called soul cakes, kind of like a small gift. It's directly connected to the idea of remembering the dead, which is central to All Hallowtide.
Wow. So those kids dressed up and knocking on our doors are actually continuing a tradition that's been around for centuries. What about jack-o'-lanterns? I mean, that's the symbol of Halloween, right?
Well, even jack-o'-lanterns, the ones we make out of pumpkins with funny faces, probably started with the Celts. They used to carve turnips, of all things, to keep evil spirits away.
Wait, turnips? That's a little creepy. But I guess it makes sense that when Halloween came to America, people started using pumpkins because they were easier to find.
Exactly. And it shows how cultural practices aren't fixed. They adapt, they take ideas from different places, and they change as people and societies change.
So Halloween, with its mix of pagan, Christian, and secular elements, is really a great example of how cultures blend and influence each other.
Absolutely. It's not some old-fashioned holiday stuck in the past. It's a living tradition that's always changing, reflecting the values and beliefs of the people who celebrate it.
I love that a living tradition reminds us that we're not just watching Halloween happen. We're part of how it changes.
That's a really important point. The choices we make about how we celebrate, the costumes we wear, what we do, even how we talk about it all play a part in how Halloween continues to evolve. It makes you wonder how Halloween will keep changing in the future, right?
It does. Will those religious roots fade away even more, or will people get more interested in those deeper meanings? Will it become even more commercialized?
It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's for sure. Halloween, like anything cultural, will keep adapting to the times. It might change in ways we can't even imagine now, reflecting new trends, new technologies, new values.
It makes you wonder what Halloween will be like in 100 years, right? But getting back to the present, we've got these interesting actions from President Biden at the White House Halloween event and centuries of tradition all mixed together. What have we learned so far from looking at it all this way?
Well, the first thing is we've seen how even something seemingly simple, like a president at a Halloween event, can be interpreted and presented in totally different ways by the media. It reminds us how important it is to think critically about what we read and see, especially when it comes to the news.
You're right. We've also learned that Halloween itself is a product of centuries of cultural exchange and how traditions change. It's not just about spooky costumes and candy. It's got these deep roots in history, spirituality, and even how we think about death.
Exactly. And I think this deep dive has given you a much broader perspective on both the Biden incident and Halloween as a whole. You have the tools to look at the information you come across and understand the complexities of how traditions develop.
I think you're right. It's like we've peeled back the layers and seen what's underneath.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to consider. Going back to those news reports about the president's Halloween event, one of the things that really stands out is how they each framed the whole thing. Fox News really focused on President Biden's age and those playful bites, almost like they were trying to, I don't know, suggest that something was off.
Yeah, you're right. They even had this video clip with a headline that said, Biden seen biting babies in costume at White House Halloween event. Definitely gave it a certain feel.
It did. And the Associated Press, totally different. They highlighted Jill Biden in her panda costume and that Hallow Read program she's got. They even mentioned the book she read, 10 Spooky Pumpkins.
It's wild how they can take the same event and present it in such different ways. The AP's coverage is definitely warmer, more family friendly, you know?
Definitely. And it makes you think about how news outlets use like small details to shape a story, the way they present things, the images they use, what quotes they pick. It all adds up to the story they're telling.
It does. So what does this tell us about, like, the media landscape today? Feels like everyone's got an angle, you know?
Well, it definitely shows that even events that seem pretty straightforward can be spun in all sorts of ways. You can take the same facts and tell lots of different stories with them, and the way those stories are told can really affect how people see those events.
Like we were talking about before, the choices journalists and editors make, even little ones, can really change the message.
Exactly. And as, people reading and watching the news, we have to be aware of that. It's so important to think critically about the sources we're getting our information from and consider why they might be telling the story that way.
So with those two articles about the Biden event, we need to keep in mind what each of them is choosing to focus on.
Right. And it's a good reminder that there's often more to a story than you see at first. It's worth digging a little deeper, looking at it from different angles, and coming to our own conclusions based on what we find.
Okay, switching gears a bit, you mentioned earlier how traditions change over time, and Halloween is like the perfect example of that. This mix of pagan, Christian, and secular elements is pretty wild when you think about it.
Yeah, it is fascinating, right? Halloween has these deep roots in ancient rituals and beliefs about death and the supernatural. And then you add Christianity with All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, bringing in the idea of remembering and honoring the dead.
And then, of course, you've got the modern secular side of things. Like today, Halloween's as much about costumes and candy as anything else.
Oh, for sure. And this evolution tells us a lot about how cultures change and how traditions adapt over time. Halloween's not some dusty old holiday stuck in the past. It's a living tradition that keeps changing, reflecting the changing values and beliefs of the people celebrating it.
I love that a living tradition. It reminds us that we're not just, watching Halloween happen. We're actually part of how it changes.
Yeah. That's a really important point. The choices we make about how we celebrate what we wear, the activities we do, even how we talk about it, all contribute to how Halloween's going to evolve. And it makes you think, how will Halloween keep changing in the future?
It does make you wonder, will it become even more commercial? Will the religious side of it disappear even more? Or will people start to care more about the deeper meaning?
It's tough to say for sure, but one thing's certain. Halloween, just like anything cultural, will keep changing with the times. It might change in ways we can't even imagine right now, reflecting new trends, new technology, or new values.
Yeah, makes you wonder what Halloween will look like 100 years from now. But getting back to now, we've got this interesting situation with President Biden at that White House Halloween event and all these centuries of tradition. What have we learned so far from looking at it this way?
Well, I think the first thing is that we've seen how even a simple event, like a president trick-or-treating, can be interpreted and presented in very different ways by the media. It really shows how important it is to think critically about what we're reading and watching, especially when it comes to news.
You're right. And we've also learned that Halloween itself is like this amazing mix of cultures and how traditions have changed over time. It's not just about costumes and candy. It has these deep roots in history, spirituality, and how we think about death.
Exactly. And I think by taking this deep dive, you've gained a much broader perspective on both the Biden incident and Halloween in general. Now you have the tools to really look at the information you come across and understand the complexities of how cultural traditions work.
I think you're right. It's like we've peeled back the layers and seen what's underneath.
And that leads us to a final thought for you to think about. As we're out there, enjoying all the Halloween fun, maybe it's worth thinking about how what we do actually shapes how Halloween changes. Do we just focus on the fun, spooky stuff, or do we try to, connect with those deeper meanings? I'm kind of thinking about those soul cakes now.
Yeah. We're not just like watching it all happen. Our choices about how we celebrate, what costumes we pick, even how much we spend on candy, it all plays a role.
Exactly. So we've gone from President Biden and those babies to medieval soul cakes to Halloween in the future. What's the big takeaway here?
Yeah. What does it all mean?
I think the biggest thing is that you've really sharpened those critical thinking skills. You've seen how a simple event can be spun in different ways by the media, and you've got a much deeper understanding now of how Halloween has evolved, how it reflects changing values and stuff. It's all connected.
It is. Like you said before, it's about peeling back those layers and looking deeper. We did that with the Biden thing, with Halloween traditions, and even with those news articles.
Exactly. And now you can do that with anything you come across. You can ask those important questions like who's telling the story, what's their angle, and what's the historical context. It's about being an informed and engaged person, really understanding the world around you.
And here's a final thought for you as you're out there trick-or-treating or maybe just handing out candy or maybe even thinking about, I don't know, the mysteries of life and death.
Mhm.
What does Halloween tell us, about our culture?
Yeah, what does it say about how we see death, the unknown tradition? It's something to think about while you're enjoying all the spooky fun.
Happy Halloween!
Happy Halloween.